My name is Chloe. I'm the outreach coordinator for LDS Earth Stewardship. And I've been gone for a couple months because I just had a baby. So I am back after maternity leave, and it's exciting to be back here and think about something else besides changing diapers. So it's nice. And tonight we are privileged to hear from Amy Walpole. So let me introduce her a little bit. Amy is a plant biologist who grew up in Utah, but currently lives in Colorado. She went to BYU and majored in environmental science. And while she was there, she researched plant ecology in aspen forests, the Mojave Desert, and the Great Basin. So she knows her stuff. She was also or part of the plant ID team, which I don't really know what that is, Amy. So if you have some spare time and want to tell us about it, I'm curious. She was also in the presidency of the Outdoor Adventure Club, the Environmental Science Club, and the C.S. Lewis Society. She moved to Colorado for graduate school at Colorado State, and she studied plant pathology there. She taught biology, and she is the mom of 3 boys who are ages 3, 2, and 1. And tonight she's going to talk about replacing your yard with native plants. I know it's been a topic that has been on the mind of a lot of us lately, for those who live in the West and have been in a drought for many of the recent years up until very recently. And so we're excited to see what she's done with her yard and what advice she can give us. So hopefully that is an introduction worthy of you. If you want to go ahead and take it away, you can. I will stop sharing my screen and turn it over to you.
Okay, yeah, thanks. Yeah, so hopefully I have something that can apply. I saw we have at least one person from Maryland. Not everyone is from Pacific or the Intermountain West here, but a lot of my experience is in Utah and Colorado. So I took the liberty of renaming it because I'm going to touch on deturfing, but that's the heart of what I want to get at with using natives is promoting biodiversity in our yards, specifically for people who live in suburbia. A little roadmap of what I'm going to be talking about today. I'll add a little bit to my background. Chloe did a great job. And then some of my inspiration for using native plants, some of the benefits for using native plants, and then for those who want to do this in their own yard, some tips for getting started, and then some examples and resources as well. So there's a sago lily for Utah, columbine for Colorado. Again, hopefully some of this will apply to people wherever you are. But when I talk about natives, it's kind of synonymous with drought tolerant planting and landscaping, just due to where we live. So she already mentioned a lot of this. Right here, I have a picture of elephant head flowers. That's kind of what sparked my interest in botany. I'm one of 8 children, grew up in Utah. So a lot of our vacations were just going to national parks around Utah and hiking in the mountains. And I found these flowers in the Uinta Mountains on one of my favorite hikes. And we would hike with those Audubon ID guides. And I wanted to see if I could find it. And I thought, wow, these look like pink elephants. And sure enough, I found it in the book, and they're called elephant heads. And I just thought it was so cool that I started looking and paying attention more to plants. And when I went to BYU, I thought, wow, you can study plants and I don't have to take any more math. This sounds great. So like she said, I was part of a lot of mentored research, undergraduate research opportunities at BYU. I worked with pygmy rabbits in sort of Grass Valley, central Utah, mycorrhizas in aspen, kind of all over Utah. We did a lot with fire ecology in my lab. Mojave Desert's the far southwest corner of Utah. So basically could see Nevada. And if you looked south, you could see Arizona from some of our research sites. And then also did some stuff with fire ecology and weeds and carpenter ants in the Great Basin. So I feel like I've spent a lot of time outside with field research, getting to know plants. And then the guy on the horse, that's a symbol for the Society for Range Management. That's the plant ID team and the ERMI team, undergraduate range management exam, that we would participate in those by going to those society national meetings. And then with Environmental Science Club and the Outdoor Adventure Club, as a Utah native, I led a few groups to have people go out and share the outdoors of Utah in a lot of different areas. So I really enjoyed that at BYU. And then leaving BYU, I did a seasonal job with the Bureau of Land Management in the botany department. So again, field job, spent a lot of time outside. I was a weed tech, so spent a lot of time doing plant surveys and spraying weeds. And then came to Colorado State University in Fort Collins and worked mostly with Canada thistle or creeping thistle, looking for a biopesticide in the form of this right here is Punccinia punctiformis, or a Canada thistle rust. So I was looking for a genetic marker to identify plants that are infected with it, and then looking at making it more effective as a systemic control. That's jasmonic acid right there, which is a plant defense hormone that we use to kind of increase the efficacy of that plant. This is this is for Poudre High School. That's where I went and taught. At the end of my master's degree, I got a teaching degree, taught for a couple of years. I did IB biology and regular biology, but at the same time, I had 3 kids. So right now I'm just hanging out at home and can do things like this, which is great. So one of the things I did with my students, quick little biology lesson for you, is we talked about biodiversity. That's one of the key points in biology. So there's biology or biodiverse richness, which is just the number of species in an area, and the evenness, which is the proportion of species. And I wanted my kids to get some practical skills as students, and I've spent a lot of time doing transects. So I had them do transects. We'd run a tape out 50 meters, and then every 5 meters, we'd put down what's called a quadrat, this square. It's a square meter. And then I'd have the kids count how many different species they saw in the meter. And we'd add them up and calculate a little bit of, we were looking specifically for weed species and then just the number of species, because, well, yeah, they're high school students. So I had them do this around the school, and around the school, it's basically Kentucky bluegrass and dandelions. So no native plants, pretty low biodiversity. And then we'd go out a few miles away from the school to open space. And as you start along this path, the first area that's on the lowland is, I say, disturbed open space. It was previously farmland and then allowed to kind of go natural. So when we did our transect in this area, most of the plants were non-native, things like cheatgrass, alfalfa, thistle, a lot of invasive species, but some you're starting to get more native plants. And then we'd go up higher on the trail and get to what you see pictured, some more open natural space. And there, the average amount of noxious or weeds that we'd see was like 1 plant per square, whereas in the other areas, it might be closer to 5. And then the biodiversity increases. Major increase once you're into more undisturbed or natural area. So why does this matter? Biodiversity is huge. It's a buffer. It protects the planet. It helps as a buffer against changes we see in the climate. And then plants are key in that they're supporting everything above that. So when I talk about practical inspiration, I'm curious, maybe you can share in the chat, has anyone read any of Doug Tallamy's books? I am currently reading Bringing Nature Home. Working on it. I have 3 little boys, so I'm better at audiobooks and have not finished this book. But he also has written a book called there's Bringing Nature Home, and then Nature's Best Hope is a similar idea. And then more of on landscape design end is The Living Landscape that I've looked at. And the gist of his idea is that there's a lot of gloom when you're looking at sort of the state of the world and the environment with extinctions of species and the amount of land that has been disturbed or converted. And so he talks about how the best hope in preserving a lot of that biodiversity is to start in your own home, in your own yard, planting natives. to understand why that's so important, I have another little biology lesson of an energy pyramid. And all the energy that comes into an ecosystem ultimately comes from the sun. So plants capture 1 to 2% of the energy that's hitting our planet from the sun. When you go to the next layer from producers, so the plants that are using that sun's energy, to consumers, you lose 90% of that energy. So you have these arrows going off for energy loss. This is not accurate. This second layer should be proportionately much smaller because you're passing on about 10%. And then you get to secondary consumers, which are eating primary consumers. Again, only 10% of that energy is passed on all the way up to tertiary consumers, is a fraction of the energy in an ecosystem. So the reason that's important is if you are in an area that does not have a lot of native plants, you're not going to be able to feed these subsequent layers. And for insects, which are the majority of our primary consumers, many of those insects, an estimate of about 90% are specialized. So when I say specialized, it's not a generalist species, it's something that feeds on a few select species to sustain it for life. A common example that a lot of people seem to know about is the monarch butterfly and milkweed. We're encouraged to grow some milkweed because monarch butterflies have this huge region, they cross and they migrate, and they lay eggs solely on these milkweeds that are dwindling. I'm curious in the chat if anyone had read that.
Mary Kay said,
Okay, yeah.
well, oh, and I was also going to pop in. Sorry. I think is he the one who wrote the book about like making your backyard a park or like a
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think yes. We are one of our presenters this year talked about that one as well. So anyways, that was just my memory.
Great. So if you've read those, like you could give this presentation for me. He's an entomologist by trade. So he really, if you're interested in insects, interested about those specialized relationships, I would encourage you to read some Douglas Tallamy books. So another question before we move on, one question that I ask my students is, do you think there are more plant species on the planet or more animal species? So just put like animals or plants for your vote in the chat of what you think are more common and just the number of species. See a couple of votes for plants. Okay. So yeah, you think like if they're the producers and everything is dependent on plants, biomass wise, yes, we have way more plants. However, there are actually about the same number actually of beetles alone as there are all the plants in the world. So I tell that to my students because all those beetles, all those insects are filling a very specific niche, and they might only feed on like the anthers of one species of flower, or they might only live on the underside of one leaf, or they might only be feeding on the insects that only live in the flowers of one plant. So yeah, there are actually way more species of animals than there are plants that we know of on the planet. So this is one of Doug Tallamy's presentations that he gave at Google talking about nature's best hope. I use this picture that I took a freeze frame, and that's not the most flattering picture of him, so I apologize. But this example is his way of saying, hey, we have all this space in suburbia. He's, I think, based out of Delaware. And so he's focused mostly on the northeast of the United States, eastern US. And if you look at this picture, you have a house and you just have a lot of mowed turf. You have some trees, but if you're an insect, this is kind of like an ecological dead zone. There's not a lot going on. There's not a lot of ecosystem services coming out of that land. Another thing, since this is my background, kind of up my alley, when I talk about weed just is a plant growing where you don't want it. But when we talk about invasive species, non-native species, noxious weeds, the reason plants kind of can go crazy, like creeping thistle, they have these life traits that make them really good at taking advantage of a community or of a region. But A major reason for that is because they are outside of their natural environment, and so they don't have their natural enemies, or the herbivores that would eat them down, attack them, are gone. So they don't have that pressure. This A is a Bradford pear, super common in landscaping. They're all over the streets of Utah. They have that kind of stinky, pungent odor in the spring, and they're very pest resistant. There are no natural enemies of Bradford pear around here, so they look great. Whereas if you have native species, you'd expect to see, you know, signs of herbivory. So for me, who's a plant lover, that can be tough because I don't want my plants to be eaten. This is a picture in my front yard of a primrose, and I saw some of these cool beetles on it. And at first I was like, man, what's eating my plant? And then I'm like, wait, I think this is actually what I'm going for here. I want to see some more bugs on my plants. And I didn't feel too bad. I got the wrong species of primrose. This is a Missouri evening primrose, which are beautiful. And I should say, I'm not a purist. My goal here is to encourage people to increase some natives in where they can, on their property and their land. But I'm not against planting other things. I think some people say shoot for 20 to 30% natives on your property to support wildlife. I put note on birds here. Birds primarily feed on insects, especially young birds. So that's another thing that Ptolemy talks about, is the importance of a lot of these larvae and caterpillars for young birds. We've lost, it's an estimated, I think, 3 billion birds since 1970, which is a third of the bird population. So birds are on the decline. There's multiple reasons for that, but a large reason is you can see a strong correlation between insect population and bird population. So this is a bush in my yard. I've lived in my house for a little over a year, and I was fortunate in that the landscape was in very poor condition, so I can basically start over. This is an Apache plume, which is a native bush. I was excited to see, but it looked mostly dead. So we're trying to decide if we should just tear it out. And then I saw this bird on it, and I got really excited. It was eating the seeds. And I think that's a goldfinch. And I decided to keep the bush. I cut it way back, and it's looking really beautiful. And then I included this last photo just because I will say I don't think all animals are created equal, and I do kind of have a fight going with the bunnies around my house, and I think they just did this to spite me. They just went and clipped off my buckwheat sulfur flowers and left it. And overall, we're trying to encourage and get along with all the animals. So for spiritual inspiration, I think in a lot of these stewardship discussions, when I was at BYU, this was quoted a lot in Doctrine and Covenants, section 104, that we are commanded to be stewards of the earth, and we're going to have to account for how well we are being stewards of the earth. And I think this is the picture of Adam and Eve teaching their children. They're like the OG stewards. They were commanded in the Garden of Eden to take care of all the plants and the animals, and that they would have dominion over them. And in that scripture, we're commanded that we're taking that role on ourselves. We are basically, just like Adam and Eve, we're supposed to be taking care of the earth. Kaze's talk from last October, he talked about stewardship, and he mentioned these principles, and I just wanted to review those a little bit as we're talking about it. The first principle is that the entire earth, including all life thereon, belongs to God. Second principle is that as stewards of God's creations, we have the duty to honor them. And he talked a little bit about that, saying that can come as supporting community efforts to take care of the earth, adopting personal behaviors that respect God's creation, and making our own living spaces more beautiful, more inspirational. The third principle is we're invited to participate in the work of creation. And we participate in the work of creation whenever we cultivate the earth or add our own constructions to this world. So for me, I don't think there's really anything better that we can do to care for the earth. I mean, there are many things, but I think a very important one is striving to increase that biodiversity, basically allowing plants and animals to live where they have existed for millennia, which they're struggling to do right now. So some more spiritual inspiration. I mentioned this, but we're stewards over all the living things, and that includes tiny insects, all the little invertebrates, the worms, the microscopic bugs that are living in your soils. I've trained my little boys to pick all the dandelions. Every time they see them, we play a little game. And one time I was out weeding and my son came over and he was pulling a weed. I was pulling a weed and he said, "Mom, what are you doing?" And I said, "Oh, I'm pulling this plant. It's a weed. I don't want it here." And he said, "God put that plant there." And I thought, yeah, he did. And I think there's goodness in all plants, but things have gotten out of proportion as like humans have spread things where they haven't existed. And it just makes me think back to Adam and Eve of, they were cast out and suddenly we've got to deal with thistles and briars, but we can joy in the sweat and toil of stewardship as we take care of the earth. And then one other thought on that is in Isaiah, it talks about the desert shall rejoice and blossom as a rose. And I just think of when we've likened that to the Utah Zion, right? I think Brigham Young quoted that, and I hope he was thinking of the woods rose, Rosa woodsii. Probably wasn't thinking of like the immaculate cultivars that we have today. The woods rose grows in the high mountain desert. It's super resilient. It can grow with very little water. Once it's established, it's going to survive without needing a lot of maintenance, and it's going to be self-sufficient. And I think we can derive a lot of inspiration from trying to blossom as the roses that occur here naturally. Another point that I also thought of is the genius loci is a Roman idea, and it's the idea that a place has a spirit, the spirit of the place, the essence of a place, or its soul. And I just think it's okay for Zion to look like Zion. We have a community all over the world. We don't want people to change. We want to celebrate their culture. And I think we should be celebrating the environment that's around us, and doing that through using some plants. So on to the natives. I'm trying to talk fast because I think I included a lot of information here. So I'm going to try and get through it. Some benefits for using natives, again, as they're so tightly tied, natives and low water, just because I'm in the West and there is low water. And so the native plants are great at not using a lot of water. I grew up in Bountiful on the bench, and every evening I like to look down. We'd get great sunsets. The air pollution really brought out the colors. And I'd look out over Antelope Island. And over the years, it went from the Great Salt Lake to what we call the Great Salt Puddles. And then as I've looked out there in more recent years, it's been kind of depressing to see the lake dwindling. Turf is the main watered plant in the US, the #1 plant over any other crop. And so we could reduce a lot of water consumption if we use less turf in our landscape. I just want to make one note on xeriscape. Xeriscape, the definition is a style of landscape design requiring little or no irrigation. I can't see, my camera's blocking that. Or other maintenance used in arid regions. I have this picture here because a lot of people think when they say xeriscape, they're thinking, oh, like rocks and maybe a cactus. But hopefully I'll inspire you. I have a lot of pictures to show what I mean by xeriscape with natives. Another benefit is they are low maintenance. It's less mowing. You don't need to amend the soil. You don't need to use a lot of fertilizers. You don't need to be using a lot of pesticides because they're great at existing where they are. Minimal upkeep. I'll talk about that a little more. And then little weeding necessary. Maybe. Weeds are always a problem, I think. But if you use proper mulching, the guideline is about 3 inches of mulch to suppress weeds. Out here, rock mulch, like pea gravel is really common, but there are wood mulches. I could talk about that for a while. Another benefit is just the aesthetics. So when I say low maintenance, you want to keep a lot of what grows there and it adds winter interest, winter texture. I'll talk about what to do at the end of the season later, but then you can add more feature to the landscape with some hardscaping with the rocks. And then flowers. I say flowers because I'm part of a lot of different kind of forums or groups that talk about native plants, and everyone they get very excited when things bloom, which is great. I try to appreciate the whole plant for being a plant, and I love their leaves. I love all parts, but yeah, the flowers are really nice, and I understand that is high aesthetic value. And then the main point is that it's increasing our biodiversity, right, for the wildlife. So wildlife habitat, providing shelter, providing food, providing nectar for pollinators, for birds, invertebrates, mammals, the whole gambit. And then they're providing ecological corridors, so these insects and animals can move through a community when you have them there, and they're providing ecosystem services. I knew I was going to be talking this evening, so I went out, and this is just me spending 10 minutes in my yard. Again, these are pretty new, but I have ladybug larvae, some different caterpillars on my native plants, some different bees. I thought this spider was really cool. I've never seen this spider before on a lupin leaf. There were things buzzing around the penstemon. So I can already see in 1 year's time, some of I'm not an entomologist, so I don't know how specialized these are, but a lot of different insects. Conversely, I sat in the grass for a while with my kids, and I was trying to find insects, and I found a few baby grasshoppers, which are generalists, and they're going to eat my garden later. And a lot of the sow bugs or pill bugs, I call them potato bugs, which eat decaying matter, another generalist species. So not a lot going on in the middle of grass. So if you're thinking, well, I need some turf, I wanted to add some information, or at least a slide in defense of turf, because I grew up playing soccer. I almost had a spiritual moment. I think the first time I went to have a soccer tournament in Las Vegas, and you're in the middle of this barren desert, and there was the Betty Wilson Soccer Complex, which is these pristine, beautiful, green, golf course-esque fields. And they're wonderful. They're wonderful to play on. I have 3 kids. I have learned that my kids do not play well with native plants all the time. It's nice to have turf. And again, I don't have a dog, but in these forums, a lot of people say, well, I need something different because I have dogs. So we could have a whole nother discussion on things you could do if you want to move away from non-native grasses. Like they have buffalo grass plugs, which is a native grass that you can put in that's really hardy and more drought tolerant. People put in clover lawns, or I've even heard of people using yarrow as their lawn. So there are other options, but also it's not a big deal to have some turf because it is very functional. There's a reason we have lots of grass. So some of my personal efforts, this is my yard. I had a baby last year, so I kind of got a late start. And in October, I had my husband, I convinced him to till up the edge of our front yard. And I got some end of season plants and I put them in. And then this was last week. And they would look a lot better, but my 1-year-old likes to pop the flower heads off. So it's coming along. And then another thing, I was hesitant to be in an HOA community. And because of that, I decided I would join the landscape committee that had just started up. And we had our spring clean event that I organized. And we had been paying like $1,000 a year to put petunias in this little border by our front signs. And we decided that we would opt out of that and have the community plant a bunch of more drought tolerant and native plants in there to help the community take some pride in it, and also to increase biodiversity. And those are going to now hopefully survive for a long time, that we don't have to do more plantings. So getting started, going to try and go through this pretty quick. If you don't know where to start, this is kind of the process that I've gone through that I would recommend just to observe. Pay attention while you're in nature or walking around your neighborhood. I would recommend getting a plant app. A lot of people use Google Lens. It's free. I use Picture This, which there's a free or a paid version, or there are other ones out there, so that you can start getting familiar with the plants around you and getting to know them. You might look up what natives are similar to ornamental plants you already enjoy, and then think of what needs you're trying to fulfill. I have some other ideas at the end, but there are things like pollinator gardens. If you need shade, look for plants that provide shade or food for birds. Or if you're trying to make it look like the prairie near your house, get an idea, and then start with the manageable area. This is like a 10 by 12 area in front of my house that, again, was kind of not in great condition. It was just a patch of clay fill dirt that was all wallowed out. So we put in some dirt there, and I either planted some seeds or starts or got some, late season plants, and it's already a much more beautiful and biodiverse area. I saw a hummingbird there the other day, which I hadn't seen hummingbirds in my yard. But get to know your space, get to know how much moisture it receives, what kind of sun exposure, what type of soil is there, how's the drainage, and then a note on turf removal. This could be a whole thing on its own, and I know this is what it was titled, so if you're here for this, ask about it later. But you can rent sod cutters to cut out sod. I would recommend renting one because we kind of made a makeshift one, and that is really hard work. We tilled ours up. You need to make sure you get deep enough. Our roots, we had for an irrigation audit tested, and our roots were like 6 to 7 inches deep, which is pretty deep. A lot of people solarize, that's putting down plastic and just letting the sun basically bake and kill your grass, and then putting mulch or soil on top of it. And then other people just put cardboard right on top of their grass. If you're familiar with like lasagna compost, it's a similar idea where you just smother the grass with cardboard, put dirt on top, put mulch on top, and then just plant right into it. That decomposes, the grass dies underneath, and then you have more nutrients for your soil. And then also a suggestion to look for rebates. This is a growing movement, especially in Colorado. If you're in a county that supports this, you can actually get reimbursed or have a crew come in and remove it for you in some instances. Utah recently started doing this in certain cities. I know I have a link here for Utah Water Savers. You can see if your city opts into some of those water saving, I guess, practices, and get a rebate for removing some turf in your lawn. So then after that, you want to make a plan. This was our plan. That's very basic for what we wanted to do by our signs in our community. Some notes is if you have irrigation, you want to remove a whole zone so that you can water the rest of your lawn still and not have issues if you need to. But it can be pretty simple. This is a landscape design that is just a free public resource from CSU. I have it linked here. I don't know if maybe we can share this later if people want to access a lot of these links that I have. But this was what we were basing our plans off of. And this is specific for Front Range. So my area, they have plants that grow here that do well, that are low water. And then they have design mock-ups that you can look at and get an idea. This is from a more professional landscaper, Albee's Ecosystems. This is also linked if you want to check out some of their ideas. They said I could share some of theirs. So some of the pictures I have is from them. And you can see the amount of detail, but the basics that you want, I think, when you're picking plants is make sure that you are getting things with similar needs. So you want to make sure that you're not planting like a cactus next to like a monkey water flower that needs a lot of moisture. And then similar exposure, not something that needs a lot of shade with full sun. Know the soil. A lot of plants need a lot of drainage. Others are totally not picky, and you can just plant them in hard pan or on a rock. And then spacing between plants, make sure you are aware, and this would be listed as you get a plant, of what their mature size is. I spend so much time outside that I was picking plants that I think of as my friends because I've seen them outside. And then we've had such a wet spring that they do not look the same as like the vernal desert. So they might get bigger in your yard. And then Another thing on sizing is just general landscape principles. You want to put low-lying, like ground cover types in front, and then taller plants back as you move. So plan for kind of that, I guess, like stepping or, yeah, kind of a terraced look. And then also looking at when they bloom. What is the shape of the bloom? What colors are you getting? Do you have complementary blooms? And then things that bloom throughout the season. So things that bloom either early in the spring or throughout the summer or into fall, so that you can have some interest all year long. If you're curious and want to look more for native plants, this is a link for Native Plant Finder, which is a national site that's really good for finding native plants and places that source native plants near you. Getting plants, just this last Saturday, I went to a plant swap that they host once a year in Fort Collins, and there are different ones around the state. This is my son holding his 3 plants that he helped me pick out. But when you're walking around, like, ask your neighbors. A lot of these plants are easy to transplant, or they'll grow and you can propagate them, or you can collect seeds. Find nurseries that source native plants. You can let plants reseed once they get established. And then you can even collect seeds. As someone who worked for the BLM, you can collect seeds. If you're going to collect a large amount, you need to get a permit, but there's nothing wrong with grabbing seeds as long as you're not in a national park or a national monument. And then a note on winter sowing. I should say I'm a graduate student still at heart. I'm very cheap. So if you have the means, by all means, talk to a landscaper who's a professional. But a lot of these tips are for people working on a budget or wanting to get started that require very little money. So I tried this out this last winter, got some old milk cartons, cut them open, put some soil in there, because a lot of native seeds need to be stratified, they need that cold period. So you can plant them in the middle of the winter in January. And then this acts as a mini greenhouse and they will grow, excuse me. And then you can transplant them around your yard once the danger of frost is past, which I found to be pretty successful. And then on planting, okay, yeah, we'll try and wrap up. So planting, some recommendations is native plants do really well with the bare root planting method, which is to wash the roots, get all the soil if you're buying a plant, right? To take that medium away so that they can have full contact with the native soil, and it helps cut down on transplant shock and get them to be more drought tolerant. And then you don't need to over amend soils because they're made for the soil. I have this wonderful picture of my yard. The landscaping in my yard is probably a little over 20 years old, about 20 years old. And there was landscaping fabric put in with a lot of this xeriscape rock type all over. And there's just soil on top of the rock and weeds growing on them. So I'm in the process of ripping out the landscape fabric, which I would recommend, if you can avoid it because it is not great for the soil. But I've had areas like this where it's just hard clay dirt and the native plants will grow in it. Unlike if you had other plants, probably would not do so well. And then be patient. The rule of thumb is first year, native plants sleep, second year they creep, and then third year they leap. I found some of mine really leaping with all the water. So kind of depends, but be patient. Don't tackle everything at once. I would encourage you. I'm in the experimental phase in my house. I encourage you to just experiment, see what grows well in your yard or in your neighbor's yard, and see what you can incorporate. Avoid spraying chemicals when possible. And then this is what I wanted to touch on quickly, is that the end of the season, you want to leave as much as you can. So litter is where plants or the insects are going to overwinter. If you're cutting everything down to the ground, and then if you don't have any bare soil, there's really nowhere for plants or these insects to overwinter. And this is my son. He found a cocoon that was down there in the litter, in the wood chips. These are just some things as I was doing my spring cleaning. I have a hard time because I itch to get in my yard and I have a hard time waiting to clean up. But you can leave the leaves, leave the tall grasses, don't butch them down in the fall, wait until the spring so things can use them as shelter. Birds, mammals, all sorts of things are using those plants. especially if you have like plants with hollow stems, you can deadhead them so they look better, but leave the stems because a lot of bees will lay eggs in the stems, and that's a great area for insects. Okay, so resources, there are many resources. These are focused on, again, Colorado and Utah. If you're interested in any of those, I could share the links or we could talk about them more, but these focus on more xeriscape, water-wise planting. And then the last thing, shared with permission, just some inspiration, and then I'll be done, of people who have converted some lawn area to more xeriscape type. So you have turf lawn, changed to primarily native planting. Here's a lawn where they put in some more hardscaping features, a path, and then once the lawn's mature. Here one you have when it was just turf, and then they had professional landscapers come in, put in some features 1 month after planting potted plants, and then 5 years later, that's what it looks like with minimal maintenance and upkeep. Again, some border planting. And then this is the last thing, just to give you some ideas, you can focus on rain gardens that help filter direct runoff and then filter your runoff. Butterfly, if you're focused on attracting some pollinators, and then crevice gardens are kind of rising in popularity, especially in Colorado, that kind of mimic nature, provide some habitat for insects and some more interest. So that's all. Just in conclusion, I would encourage you to think about how you can help from insects up. Although, I mean, we love elk, we love the birds, but really we're not going to have a lot of those larger megafauna that are so loved if we don't start by encouraging some more biodiversity through our plants and insects. So thanks.